You are listening to the Arkham Horror Book Club, a collection of the strange and the unusual. With your host, Leeman Kessler, here to guide you through this terrifying world. We hope to broaden your horizons while tingling your spines. Do enjoy. Leave on the lights if you must.
Hello and welcome to the Arkham Horror Book Club. I'm Leeman Kessler and I'm joined today by poet and author Helen Marshall. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here.
Now, Helen, you've written for a couple of different anthologies as well as having collections of your own fiction and poetry, yes?
That's right. I did two poetry chapbooks. The first one was called Skeleton Leaves and the second one was called The Sex Lives of Monsters.
Ooh, that's very exciting. I first was introduced to your work through Hairside Fleshside, which was very fun. Sanditon, or Sanditon? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that.
I call it Sanditon. People call it all sorts of things. I get Sandition a lot, which I don't think is right. So, sort of a process of elimination, really.
Okay, either way, that was what introduced me to your work. And I should do full disclosure. Before I knew you as a author in the world of weird fiction, I knew you through academia and my wife. You guys were both at the Center for Medieval Studies, studying medieval studies, I guess, as you do.
I was studying medieval studies, and actually that's really where Hairside Fleshside came out of. I was doing a bunch of research on 14th century manuscripts in Oxford when I sort of came up with what the project was going to be. Because medieval parchment is made out of sheepskin, and so each of the pages has a hair side and a flesh side. So the hair side is the bit of the skin that's cut all the hair follicles. It's the outside of the sheep, and then the flesh side is the smoother bit that's, the inside of the sheep.
Presumably the more useful part to do some writing on.
Yeah, well, you kind of do both, but you can feel the difference. One of them is kind of like soft and velvety, and then the other is sort of like a little bit smoother.
So you've actually got to get your hands on some of the actual medieval parchment itself, or?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I look at I spent 2 weeks in a cathedral measuring punctuation marks in a manuscript, which is probably the weirdest project that I have ever done.
Well, yes,
weirder in a different way than weird fiction.
I hope it was useful.
I think so. I got an article out of it.
Well, that's what matters.
Yeah.
Now, it's a quick question, I guess. Then, is writing articles about punctuation spacing, like, is that, put you in a stranger mindset than, writing about words being on the inside of people's skin?
I think that the interesting thing about doing work like that is I love working on medieval manuscripts, but much of the sort of day-to-day work on them is actually kind of dull things like measuring punctuation marks. They're looking at, how somebody wrote down a T, comparing it across manuscripts. And so when you do that for several hours, you kind of want to break out and do something really wild after, which is, I think, probably where my fiction came from.
And how long have you been writing? And writing, I guess, both for fun and professionally?
I guess I started when I was much, much younger. I was part of a medieval reenactment group called the Society for Creative Anachronisms for a while, and I was a medieval bard there, and so I wrote tons of medieval poetry. I never admit this online.
Oh, dear.
So this is my confessional. So that's really where I got my start doing a lot of writing. And then once I went to grad school, largely everything stopped, as grad school kind of puts a stop to everything.
It does take over.
Yeah, and then about halfway through the PhD, I joined up with Cheesine Publications. I met them randomly at the Word on the Street book festival, and I was sort of at the point where I was feeling like I wanted to branch out a little bit and do something creative again. And so I offered to do some editing work for them for free, and they said, "We can pay you." And I said, "That's even better."
That is amazing.
And so that kind of got me rolling again and turning me back towards fiction and poetry.
And Cheesine is local to Toronto?
They are, yeah, that's right.
Did they start here, or have they kind of been bouncing around?
No, they've always been based out of here. I think they're 6 years old now. So
okay, and where did they originate in?
They started out of the Chiaroscuro online magazine, which is one of the longest running sort of dark fiction magazines. It started back when, we sort of were starting to get the internet, I suppose, and people were starting to put up literature on it. And that sort of grew into, at one point, a print-on-demand operation, and then they've just basically grown it up since then. So now it's probably one of the largest Canadian independent genre presses, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and they do the amazing series readings.
Yeah, that's right. Sandra Casturi and I got that started a couple of years ago, and we also had with it the Toronto SpecFit Colloquium, which was sort of a half academic TED Talk one-day event that we were running alongside it. But the Chi series is a lot of fun. I was out at one of the events yesterday. We were doing a book launch.
Oh, great. What was being launched?
I was doing the book launch for my most recent fiction collection, Gifts for the One Who Comes After. And Nancy Baker was launching a novel called Cold Hillside, and Gemma Files was launching a sort of mosaic collection of short stories called We All Go Down Together. And David Nichol did his second short story collection, Knife Fight and Other Struggles, which is nice because he does reports on City Hall, and he has a wonderful kind of Rob Ford pastiche parody, kind of, Rob Ford meets Fight Club, basically.
That's what the city needs to help with the healing.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about Gifts for the One Who Come After. Is this also another series of short stories, or what's the deal with this?
This is a series of short stories as well. I started writing them when I was at the Clarion West writing workshop, which is sort of like a 6-week-long intensive workshop taught by people like Chuck Palahniuk and George R.R. Martin. So that was really cool. I got to work with them for a little while. And I was sort of working on it while I was finishing up my PhD dissertation. But whereas my first collection, Hairside Fleshside, was really about sort of big history questions, like the long view, I think Gifts for the One Who Comes After is kind of much more about personal narratives and family struggles, but also still very weird.
Oh, good. Well, that's what we want. We want a bit more weird. I guess that leads us right into what led you towards weird fiction.
That is a really good question. I was reading a lot of weird fiction for Cheesine Publications when I started doing editorial work for them, because they specialize in that. And that, I suppose, got me started. I was always drawn to fantasy literature and not so much to horror, which is, I suppose, now kind of where my writing leans a little bit more. And when I grew up, I read a lot of, Guy Gabriel Kay and Charles DeLint. And I remember when I got started, I was trying to write all of these Charles DeLint kinds of stories, about sort of bohemian artist types encountering fairies. But they never really worked for me, and I couldn't figure out why it was. But then when I started writing weird fiction, I sort of realized I could write stuff that actually, I want to say that more accurately reflected what my life was like, but that is, I suppose, a little bit misleading because I don't think I live the life of most of the characters in my stories. But I think that they reflect more of my interests. So there's lots of stuff about, there's some stuff about academics in there, but also a lot of stories set in various places that I've traveled to for research, which I think is a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, that sounds really great. You had a wonderful line. I was looking up some of your older interviews, and you were talking about how you view poetry versus the short fiction, and you were talking about poetry being sort of for the self and short fiction being for the other. And it sounds like you've kind of blended that a bit in this new series, if it's a bit more personal.
I think that's true. I mean, what's interesting about poetry is in poetry you're really trying to encapsulate your personal feelings about an experience, and it's all about representing in an interesting way your own viewpoint. Whereas I find with short fiction, it's a little bit more experimental. You kind of start with different viewpoints or different approaches. But what makes a good short story, I think, is when you can find something really honest and personal in the center of it, even if you're casting it in a different light or exploring it. But I find the best short fiction comes when you write about an issue that you have very strong but muddled feelings about.
Oh, okay.
And then use the fiction as a way to kind of represent the different viewpoints and let them fight it out.
And it seems that this is letting you travel to all sorts of amazing places, and that's the glamorous life of the writer, I guess. Where all has your writing taken you so far?
Well, I've been lucky in that I've been able to mix writing and academic research. I think that the glamorous life of the academic more easily pays for trips to various places.
Oh, wonderful.
But right now I'm doing a 2-year postdoc in Oxford, and the benefit of that is it means you're very close to a lot of really neat places. So this year I went to Reykjavik for the new Chaucer conference, which was amazing. We got to go climb on glaciers and sit in volcanic lagoons and things like that. that was really wild. And then I also went around Belgium and Amsterdam, and I finished off a trip around some of the Greek islands as well.
Oh, wow.
So it was more travel, I think, than I have probably ever done before, but it was a lot of fun.
And are you starting to feel like that's beginning to sort itself into creative outlets as far as you're starting to get story ideas out of that, or do you just sort of let it generally kind of wash over you?
I find that when I travel, one of the best ways to experience a place is to try to write a story there while I'm traveling around. So I did write a story when I was in Reykjavik about something called necropants.
I was going to ask if you got to see the necropants.
I didn't get to see the necropants, which was a shame because they were about a 3-hour car drive away from where we were. But one of my friends who does Icelandic studies told me about them in advance, and I became fascinated with them. So I wrote a story about a woman who starts dating another woman in Iceland and discovers that she has a pair of necropants.
Like you do.
Yeah, in her attic. And then when I was in Greece, I've written a bunch of stories about Greece. I went there last year after I finished my PhD, and it was just fascinating. My mom wanted to be an archaeologist when she was growing up, and so she's the one who's organized those particular trips because she wants to go see all the ruins, and largely I've tagged along. But it's been great to be able to see all of the ancient sites. And so I've gotten a bunch of story ideas out of that, really. There was one particular island called Delos, which I thought was amazing. It was supposed to be one of the birthplace of Apollo, and there's a giant lake, or there used to be a giant lake, which apparently held the sperm of Zeus in it. And when French archaeologists arrived there in the 19th century, this island was just filled with temples, just tons of temples, because it was one of the most stable points in the Mediterranean.
Oh, okay.
And so as a result, the earthquakes didn't wipe everything out as they did with other places. And so it became kind of like a bank for the area. Everybody would go put their treasures there because they knew things weren't falling down. But anyway, yeah, so the pool filled with the sperm of Zeus, the archaeologists showed up and they drained the lake out because they were getting malaria from all of the mosquitoes that were breeding in there. And I think that there's something so funny and bizarre about the idea of people getting malaria from mosquitoes that have been, spawned in the sperm of Zeus.
That is amazing.
Yeah, so that will become something. I don't know what it is.
Well,
yet,
given that female mosquitoes are the ones who give malaria, and the maleness of the sperm, yeah, that is a bizarre sort of coming together right there.
Yeah, it's the strangest STD I think you'll ever find.
All right then, and you're going to be off to Oxford again, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I'm going back for probably another 6 weeks before I come back for Christmas, and then spending most of next year there as well.
I got to visit Oxford a few years back when Rachel, my wife, was studying there, and I mean that's a city that can just give you all sorts of inspiration. It's just incredibly old and strange, and this bizarre mixture of this great history with a couple of Games Workshop stores just bouncing around. It's this wonderful fusion.
It's true. It's a little bit like medieval Disneyland is how I tend to think of it. There's an amazing museum that's maybe 10-minute walk away from where I live, the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is essentially what you would imagine. It's what I imagine the inside of my head to look like.
Okay.
It's nothing. It's a bizarrely arranged collection. So rather than organizing it by culture, it's organized by object. So they'll have there's the basket section, and then there's nothing but baskets from all sorts of different places. And here's the sword section, swords from different places. But then there's one section which is the treatment of dead enemies section. Good. Yeah, which is right up my alley, I suppose. And it has all sorts of shrunken heads and things like that. And I think it's a really neat place to wander around because it's also filled with all of these drawers with sort of barely labeled artifacts and things, and you can just open up the drawers and explore all of the things that aren't actually on display. And so kids are allowed to wander around after hours, sometimes with flashlights. They do a Friday night thing where you can just explore the museum, in darkness with nothing but a flashlight.
All right.
And that's pretty cool.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Man alive. Okay, so definitely need to take my little daughter Amanda to Oxford before too long. So starting in academia and then getting a chance to sort of blend that with the world of fiction, where are you seeing the kind of both the parallels and the contrasts there? I
think that there's a surprising amount in common between academic work and creative writing, in that both of them, you're trying to find a narrative. So when you're doing medieval research, for example, you've got all of these different facts and you're trying to find something that connects them. But you're trying to be as truthful as possible. You're trying to represent things as accurately as possible. And so the difference is in fiction, you don't have to be particularly accurate. You just have to be emotionally honest. You don't have to match up with anybody else's viewpoint about the way that the world works. But I find that my creative writing works best when it sort of bounces off my academic work as well, because the Middle Ages is so strange that it's fun to find ways of looking at the world in the Middle Ages that you can then sort of update and think about in new terms. So, for example, in Hairside, Fleshside, I wrote a story called Blessed about an 8-year-old girl who receives the body of Saint Lucia of Syracuse from her father, because her parents are now divorced. So when she goes back to her mother's place, her mother freaks out because her father's now got her this amazing birthday present, and so she has to one-up it by getting her the body of Joan of Arc. And I find the kind of commodification of saints in medieval culture to be really, really interesting. And so I wanted to explore that a bit. And also ideas of what martyrdom is and the way that martyrdom reconstructs a notion of love to be around pain. And then that sort of in the story spills over into the way that the mother is then relating to her daughter, and how she's passing on this idea of love as suffering.
All right, then. That seems nice and mild. And are the external examiners more harsh in fiction world, or are they pretty mild?
Oh, that's a good question. I found, well, I mean, my work has been really positively received so far, so I can't say that people have been particularly harsh, but it's different because people respond to you in very different ways when you're a writer, because you're just putting your work out there and people can say whatever they want about it. Whereas in academia, I suppose there's guidelines for the way that criticism works, but the real world is just a free-for-all. And so you get weird sort of responses. So for example, last weekend, my sister Laura, who does a lot of the marketing work for me because she's amazing, she sent me 2 reviews that I had received, and both of them liked the collection, and then they had stories that they liked particularly, and then they had stories that they thought were weaker, but both of them chose the opposite stories for the ones that they thought were strongest and the ones that they thought were weakest. So one review found, one set of stories to be strongest, and the other thought that those were the weakest ones. And I found that with Hairside, Fleshside as well. I would get these reviews, and one of them would say, Helen Marshall very wisely front loads the collection with all of her best stories, and then the next one would say, Helen Marshall very wisely backloads the collection with all the best stories. And I think part of what that is because my writing skirts the boundary between genre and literary fiction, and so I think if a critic comes from one perspective or the other, then they'll find some stories speak to them more than the other subset might. And
do you find working in that boundary is been really profitable for you, or do you think that you need to specialize more, or where do you find yourself drawn?
I really like walking the line. I mean, I think that there's always a potential danger because people who are very firmly in either the literary camp or the genre camp are skeptical of one another. But I like work that goes wherever it wants, really. I don't like sticking to one particular way of doing things. And I find sometimes the problem with genre fiction is it tends to replicate itself, because that's exactly what it's trying to do. Genre is about repeating conventions and then finding ways to twist them a little bit, but largely about giving people something that feels a little bit more comfortable to them, and something that's a little bit more familiar. And I liked playing with genre conventions because I also like non-realist fiction an awful lot. I like the fact that you can make anything happen in genre fiction. You don't have to conform to the laws of reality, and that means you can trick your reader and you can surprise your reader and do exciting things. But at the same time, if somebody gives me a vampire anthology, I want to go write the least vampiric story for that anthology that somehow can still kind of skirt in there.
And how has that been for you, working in other anthologies, working with other writers in sort of, not just your own kind of mold?
Well, it's been interesting over the last year because I've got far more anthology requests than I ever have in the past. And it can be kind of tricky because you want to try to find something that's going to please the editor and please the readers that the editor is pitching towards specifically, but you still want to make something that feels like it's yours. And so it is kind of a hard balance to meet. But that's also the fun bit. The fun bit, I find restriction can be very profitable. So if somebody says, write a story about Carcosa, for example, and the King in Yellow, then you want to try to do something a little bit different. You were talking about Joe Pulver before we started the interview, and I just finished doing a story for him for an anthology about Carcosa that he's putting together. And the story was actually inspired by my trip to Delos. I wanted to write a story about Carcosa being sort of a really lousy tourist destination, basically.
With the awful gift shops and the tchotchkes.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I wanted to take something that kind of has a reverential position and then say, well, what if we do something different with it? What if we recast this? How can we still find something that speaks to the King in Yellow mythos about it, but approaches it from a different angle?
Disappointed tourism, that seems very Canadian, right? That, and working in the world of Canada and sort of Canadian publishing and still traveling, or do you see a kind of a difference between how Canada approaches genre fiction? I read an entire book of Canadian post-apocalyptic stories, which was very strange.
Is that Sylvia Moreno Garcia's book? Oh, she's
yes.
Great.
No, it was wonderful.
It's fantastic. Yeah, I do think Canada does some things very differently. For one, because it's a smaller marketplace in general, there's a lot more freedom to experiment with genres, whereas in the American market, things tend to be segregated because there's so much more being produced. Canada also has the benefit of an amazing grant system, which is very supportive of writers, and that gives people a little bit more freedom. I find it's also more... I think that there's something that's slightly more subtle about the way that Canadians tend to write than, for example, the way that Americans tend to write. I think that there's a little bit more of a British influence in Canadian genre fiction, especially when I think about horror. I think that we tend to draw a lot from British writers like Ramsey Campbell, for example. I think we like the slow burn ghost stories a little bit more.
Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you so much. Where can folks find your work, and where can they find you online?
You can find me online at helen-marshall.com, and you can find my book, Gifts for the One Who Comes After, and also Hairside Fleshside, my first collection, through Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, and basically any online retailer. Also in actual physical bookstores.
Amazing! You just have to find the bookstores.
Yeah, you just have to find the bookstores. And then it's sort of like a scavenger hunt we've got set up.
Well, maybe we can turn the lights off, find some British children, give them flashlights, and it's in the map.
Yeah, they'll either find my book or a shrunken head.
Either way, it's going to be an adventure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.
And thank you for everyone. Have a wonderful week.
Arkham Horror Book Club is in no way affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or the Arkham Horror series of board games, which are really complicated and take too long to play.